Hello and welcome to our Divergent discussion. I'm Michelle and I'm the founder of Kaboose. Kaboose is an online platform that makes neurodiversity easier to understand, navigate and support through practical knowledge, helpful tools and community. We also equip organisations with practical knowledge, tools and insights to build a more inclusive workplace. So as a HR professional with over 20 years, should I say, or more, across 6 different industries, I've seen firsthand the challenges that organisations face in creating truly neuro-inclusive workplaces. And that's one of the reasons why we created Kaboose, to turn awareness into action. And we get to work with some really amazing people like Vicki. Just a reminder that the discussion is being recorded so that we can pop that on our YouTube channel and in the app for our users who can't join us live. You can also ask questions, so I will ask Vicki a series of questions, but if any of you have questions, feel free to drop those into the chat and we'll get to them throughout the conversation or at the end. Now, I'm going to read your bio because I don't want to mess it up. So, Vicki is a nationally recognised neuroinclusion and disability inclusion specialist with more than 20 years of experience supporting neurodivergent people across Australia, the UK, and global networks. As the founder of Little Neuroinclusion Agency and former Chief Operating Officer of Specialist in Australia, Vicki combines lived experience, deep industry expertise, and senior leadership to help organisations create more inclusive workplaces. Following her late ADHD diagnosis, Vicki continues to lead conversations around neurodiversity, workplace culture, leadership, and belonging with practical, human-centred approach, which is both insightful and deeply impactful. And I can definitely attest to that with my time working with Vicki through Specialist and really excited to have you here to talk to us about all things neurodiversity in the workplace. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So when you think about navigating the workplace as a neurodivergent human, what comes up for you first?
I love this question. I think for me, it's about safety in terms of psychological safety. And it's also about effort, the effort that goes into being a neurodivergent human in a neurotypical workplace involves a significant amount of effort, more so than for neurotypical employees. And so as a result, it's not necessarily the effort for the work itself, it's the effort of being in the environment that might not be conducive to work for you, or the effort of being in the social environment or the culture. And the culture of the workplace really sets the tone for expectations around socializing, communication, all those sorts of elements. And that's incorporated in the environment piece. But I think, I think for me, navigating that as a neurodivergent human means almost double, if not more, the amount of effort that goes into simply just doing the job compared to their neurotypical counterparts. And that to me is where the conversation should be heading, if it's not already there, because it's the unseen effort that leads to very significant, if not detrimental, impacts on the employee in terms of well-being and being able to, obviously thrive at work, which is the goal.
You touched a little bit on psychological safety, and we're finally seeing the legislation catching up with what should have been there for a long time. But when you think about the biggest challenges neurodivergent people still face in workplace, how do you think about that along with the psych safety?
Yeah, great. Look, I think we still see the barriers largely in the same sort of 4 categories. So most certainly communication communication is one of the most significant barriers and continues to be, because we have these almost traditional ways of communicating in the workplace, and some cultures and some workplaces do shift the needle a little bit in regards to that. But certainly there is still very almost neurotypical ways of communicating that's expected that you understand and know when you start the job. So that's a significant barrier. And, I often in the training, I often talk about even just simple, obviously vague, things like that are sarcastic or vague terminology that's not really saying exactly what you expect of the person, but also acronyms. In every workplace, there is hundreds and hundreds of acronyms. And if you ask any leader, I do a lot of leadership training. If you ask any leader, you'll actually find that almost half of the leaders also don't know what the acronyms are. And so it's actually really important to just step back and be clear in our communication for everyone. And then in processes and policies, obviously, we're really still very much so relying on processes and policies that were set a long time ago and are very neurotypical. And the best example is obviously the traditional recruitment post process in regards to interviews, and still relying on that as a form of assessment is only going to put neurodivergent candidates, behind in terms of capacity to show what we can do and how we can do the job as best we can. And I've mentioned the environment. That is critical. And once again, I hope organizations are now starting to understand the critical importance of the environment in terms of creating an inclusive workplace. And that, that can be alongside not just the physical space, but once again, the stress culture of that team or that department or that workplace. It can be, simple things that allow for that environment to feel supportive and where someone can start to bring more of themselves to work. And then finally, the biggest one is attitudinal, which is at the core of why we do what we do, right? Because it is the attitudes of the people or the leadership or the executive or the culture that leads to assumptions. It leads to expectations. It leads to lack of understanding. And as a result, that is what we're trying to shift. We're trying to shift the mindsets, reduce assumptions, reduce expectations on neurodivergent employees. And in doing so, that in itself can be the biggest shift in terms of being more neuro-inclusive. If we can start to not make assumptions about why somebody is late, for example, and actually lean into being curious and asking, simple things like that will make a huge difference for a leader to lean into understanding and removing those assumptions. And I think that in itself, if we can start to shift that barrier, you will find that will definitely shift the needle. But it's not it's simple.
It sounds simple, doesn't it? But it's just
we're selling changing mindsets, and that's a very difficult thing to do. But I think we are getting there.
I think you've raised so many great points there. The first one, I think, communication, and just relating that back to effort. So, for a neurodivergent employee to navigate the nuances in communication, whether it's in that sort of social, in the kitchen kind of conversations, or whether it's in a meeting and, the conversation is maybe moving fast and trying to sort of stay on top of where it's going. Or one thing I've noticed of late too is when people, there's louder people talking, they're sort of dominating the conversation. For many neurodivergent people, trying to interject, is very difficult. And so the effort that it takes to do that is quite large.
Yeah, that's right. There's so many parts of what you've just said in terms of navigating the social conversation. So it could be just a casual water cooler conversation, lots of small talk, lots of back and forth. But even that can be challenging to navigate, knowing when's your turn to speak and you're, sort of thinking about what you're going to say, what's appropriate. So that's the more sort of small talk, casual conversation. But then, as you say, in those team meetings or around the boardroom, around the board table, it's really often our culture of the workplace is really only allowing for the loudest or the most vocal to be heard. And therefore you're missing out on all of the diverse thinking of the entire
Yeah.
team. And that in itself that's an example of a shift that can happen to be making your culture or your team even more inclusive, is just by shifting the expectation that, or the assumption, sorry, that not everyone wants to speak up just because they haven't had the chance to interject or the
Mm,
opportunity.
it's true. When you say changing mindsets and, shifting the mindsets, can you give us an example of, something you've seen recently around having to really work with an organization to shift mindsets? What sort of things would you be trying to shift?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question. I think this is where the understanding that simple, small steps towards neuroinclusion make a big difference. That's our tagline of our business, and it's it is that simple. Sometimes it's the little things that we do every day that can make a significant difference in terms of our communication, or backtracking, and when you've stated an acronym, backtracking and repeating what it actually stands for, or um, leaning into being curious, like I said before, in terms of assumptions. So it's really easy to fall into a habit of making an assumption about somebody, for example, who doesn't contribute in a meeting. The assumption might be that they don't know, or they don't want to, or, but we want to be leaning into being curious about what that person thinks. Or, like I mentioned before, the example of turning up late. We know so much now about the intersection of ADHD, for example, and sleep-related conditions. So
Absolutely.
it's
Mm.
it's it's actually, I'm surprised the research is not more widely known, because it's significant. It's almost like 80% or something, 70 to 80% of ADHDers experience some sort of sleep-related condition. So obviously that's the variation from sleep apnea to restless leg syndrome to whatever it might be. But going to sleep at night, I don't know about you, but as an ADHDer, I turn on at night,
It's
that's my,
yeah, that's right.
like, I could spend all day tired, and then at night it's just, and so therefore, there's been many examples of where we've placed people into perhaps their first job in the past. And of course, the manager might think, if that person is turning up late, that they're not motivated. Maybe they're not
Yeah.
keen about the job. Maybe as a new starter, the perception of them turning up late is they should be trying their best. However, if that individual has spent that entire night before trying their best to go to sleep but not able to, that is what we need to look at. We need to look at the effort that goes into for that person to turn up on time is significant.
Mm,
Not to mention the sensory experience of public transport if you live in a city or travel to work in a
mm.
city. That in itself can be very challenging and exhausting, taxing. And so, I think the mindset shift that we want to see and start to see is moving away from assumptions, leaning into understanding about neurodivergence of that individual. So what I want leaders in all workplaces to start to think about is not understanding neurotypes, but understanding the human, because it is about supporting the human and not the label. The human
Yeah.
could have an intersection of so many things going on for them, not exclusive to neurodivergence, obviously. And so
Mm.
the makeup of that human is what makes them who they are, and it's about understanding that individual. So the mindset shift I'm trying to support leaders to have is, you don't need to be the expert of autism. You don't need to be the expert of dyslexia. You need to learn and lean into understanding that person, because they are the
Mm.
experts of their neurodivergence and their lived experience.
Yeah, it's such a great point around whether someone turns up, on time or not, and whether they're engaged or not. I had a great conversation with a neurodivergent led business last week, and she described to me an employee who's now been with her for, I think she said 6 or 7 years. And prior to that, they had been job hopping because they couldn't get to work on time. Uh, she made a simple adjustment. Later start time, start at 12, finish at 8. That
Um,
person has stayed in their job performing extremely well. for that whole period of time. So it shows just what these adjustments, can do. I'm sure we'll get to adjustments in a moment. I know we've got a couple of questions already, so I might jump to those before we continue on. Robin is said, Vicky, aren't most of these supports you're talking about also apply to neurotypical employees? Yes, absolutely. I know of so many people who struggle in the workplace with poor communication, use of TLAs, abbreviations, I assume, short form discussion, lack of detailed instructions. I would say yes, quite often, and I'm sure you agree, Vicky, that whenever I talk to people, the things we talk about as inclusive practices actually make it better for everyone.
Yeah, that's right. We talk a lot about universal design when thinking about what you've just said, Robin. So we know that what is good for a neurodivergent employee is good for everyone. And I've been saying that for 20 years. And to the point that I remember trying to advocate for example, work from home adjustments for an amazing woman that I was working with to place into employment back in London in 2006 when I was working at the National Autistic Society. And I remember the place of employment that she landed in, she really needed that adjustment of work from home because, as we now know, particularly for neurodivergent females, the exhaustion and the burnout, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, that comes from going to the workplace was significant. So for her to participate fully, work from home was what she really needed. But I mean, back in 2006, you can imagine it was like I was asking them to move the physical building closer to her home. That's how long it was taking. It had to go through so many hands. And to be honest, I think it was still a stretch for them to provide that in the end. And so thanks to the pandemic, if we can say that, the silver lining of the pandemic was that we now see that actually work from home works for everybody. It allows for everyone to consider what they need and how they work best. And so everything you've just listed there in terms of, yes, communication, detailed instructions, information in advance. Of course, this is the whole point, is that it is nothing that is beyond what's expected for everyone. It's something that is just good communication, good management practice. And like I said before, what we know works for a neurodivergent employee works for everyone. And that's the whole concept of understanding it through the lens of psychological safety too.
Exactly. Yeah. So we sort of started to touch on, I guess, burnout, but many neurodivergent people mask at work to meet these expectations. So whether it's communication expectations, meeting expectations, start times, etc. How does this shape their experience, and can it contribute to burnout or more frequent job changes, which one example I heard last week talked about. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question as well. So I think, so first of all, masking, if we think about what masking is, it is the concept that neurodivergent individuals mean that we need to hide or camouflage certain traits or parts of ourselves in order to fit in. And so it's almost a bit of a coping mechanism. And so, of course, to some point, absolutely every human who is an employee has to mask to a certain extent. If we all brought all of ourselves to work, then, I don't think that would...
Might be a bit chaotic sometimes.
It would. Of course, there is rules and code of conduct to be respected of being an employee. However, for neurodivergent employees, it is constant. So it is forcing eye contact when we know that eye contact for some autistic individuals, for example, is physically painful. And yet we are still expecting that. It is asking for making small talk, for example, when I don't know about you, Michelle, but I've never met a neurodivergent person who enjoys small talk. And it's not that we can't do it. It just feels like it's creating a lot, we're suppressing
it's like
a lot
boring.
Yeah. But it's also the sensory experience. You're suppressing a lot of sensory discomfort potentially in that kitchen with lots of smells, in, a lift that's very busy. Someone's trying to make small talk next to you and you're feeling really overwhelmed by the environment. And also, yes, of course, the topic, I don't know about you, but my brain almost, it's like I have lots of bouncing balls. Well, this is the way I describe it. I have a million tabs open, just like a browser.
Yes.
And then
Me
for each
too.
of those tabs has a bouncing ball
Yes.
attached to it. And so if someone's making small talk to me, of course I'm engaged and I'm interested, but I'd rather ask them something more meaningful for starters. And then I've also got the bouncing balls distracting me with all the things that I should be doing. And so, these are just, it exhausts us more. Also for autistic individuals, it's um, the social expectations, so the eye contact, all the nonverbal communication, what is okay to say, that can be challenging, all those, elements of just being an employee in the workplace. And so I feel like masking is less understood from that perspective. The extra work that goes into it means that, once again, we expend more energy early on. That's not the actual job, but another amazing autistic woman that I've worked with for a while, she explained it really beautifully. She said, learning the job of your job, the technical job is one FTE. That whole job description, that's an
Yes.
FTE. But for an autistic person, particularly autistic women, learning the social side of the workplace as an entire other FTE. So that is two, working doubly as hard, like I said before, for that social side of things. And that's what's exhausting. And so we're now starting to see that that means that there is a higher rate of burnout simply because the systems and the environment are not set up to support the individuals. And that work from home is a really great example because it's obviously a mandate, which means it's cohort thinking. It's thinking about the masses as opposed to the individuals. And, I know that prior to COVID, 75% of autistic women wanted to work part-time because of that challenge that I mentioned before. And so therefore couldn't participate fully. Whereas now, because of COVID and the work from home changes in some workplaces, has allowed more autistic women to work full time. And that's what it's all about. And so there's a statistic that 9 out of 10 neurodivergent women have burnt out in the last 12 months. And last year I ran a leadership series for neurodivergent leaders. And all of the females in that group said that they could almost schedule the burnout quarterly or however frequent it was in their diary. That's how frequent and predictable it was.
Gosh.
And that to me speaks of the systemic issue. So the expectations on neurodivergent individuals is, it's more demanding and it shapes their experience in terms of poor well-being and, fatigue. And for me, I didn't realize because my late diagnosis was only sort of a year and a half ago, coming up to 2 years. But prior to that, I had been diagnosed with every fatigue-related condition that's out there. And that was a consequence of being neurodivergent as opposed to, it being part of
being
it.
a thing.
It's
Yeah.
a consequence of the extra work that we put in and the rate in which we move through things and the systemic issues that are present. And I think that, that's what we need to start to understand more, how we can shift that.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I think, like you said at the start, the actual load of all the different things at work, it does take its toll. So when you think about all of the demands for a neurodivergent person, the masking, the navigating the conversations, navigating the meetings, the instructions, the hours, etc. What are the signs that someone should watch out for when, maybe they're headed towards that burnout cycle? And hopefully it's not every quarter, but
It's a great question. When I was thinking about this answer, I think it goes back to that individual experience because everybody experiences things differently, and it can vary what that looks like in terms of both triggers and signs of burnout. So I think it's about leaning into ask. If you're a leader or a fellow ally in the workplace, it's leaning into asking and seeing what that looks like for that person. I've heard things like communication will reduce in terms of frequency or, not responding. I've heard things like changes to patterns in attendance obviously can be a big signal, and just changes to the way in which that person is presenting can be common. But I would be more thinking about what's going on for that person in terms of um, how is that impacting their well-being? Because that's what we're not doing just yet, because we're looking at, oh, well, that person's not turning up, and so therefore that's affecting their performance or
Delivery.
the team, or that's right, delivery focused, where I think
Yeah.
it's the human. We need to be looking at the human and saying, well, what's happening to you that means that this is happening? What can I do to help you during this time? If you're a leader, once again, but anybody,
Mm.
it's looking at how we can reduce the need to expend that extra energy before the burnout. And sometimes that's not always easy, but it's looking at what's happening in the environment, what's required in terms of the environment, and how can we look at the way in which they're doing their job, the processes, maybe some different supports or tools to be able to reduce those elements that are exhausting us or adding to that exhaustion. And yeah, I think in terms of what it looks like is different for everyone, but we did a white paper. I was lucky enough to call through a white paper with Superfriend last
Oh,
year.
yes. We read
Yes.
we read that one just
Yes.
recently.
And
Yeah.
that
Yeah, great.
a lot of that, the findings were really incredible, actually, but it said things like that 43% of neurodivergent employees are already burned out, which is much higher than the sort of general population or their neurotypical counterparts. And I think we found that it's really simple, the things that can shift the dial in terms of making someone feel safe and making somebody feel like they can protect their energy a little bit more. So yeah, it was a really interesting paper, which I think I'll talk about in some other answers. So I
Yeah,
won't keep
good.
going.
Yes. Yeah, one thing I was thinking of with the burnout too, as you were talking, is that when you've got a very high performer, typically, and then there's a higher error rate coming on, for me, it gives pause to say, is the workload too high? Are you okay? Is something else going on? Some of those questions I think can be really helpful to
Yeah.
find out whether someone is feeling burnt out, and then having a safe place to be able to say how you are tracking, because
Yes.
quite often if the organisation is not a safe place to say, then people won't be able to speak about what's really going on for them.
Yes. Yes. That's exactly right. And that's achieved through the leader modeling that, prioritizing their own well-being needs or flexible needs to be able to show that it's okay. It's okay to say, I'm not feeling 100% today with no reason, no, not that you are have the flu or whatever it might be, just not
Yes.
feeling yourself, and whatever that, and that rest is the answer. Like sometimes I've just needed a day just to rest, and then I'm okay. But
Yep.
without that, in previous phases of my career, I felt the need to just show up anyway. And I think, yes, high performing people do that, particularly neurodivergent women. There's a lot of uh, 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 an intersection, I think, in a way, of um, ADHD females who are typically high performers and have always just pushed through those signs for
Mm,
themselves, and that and instead what we need to start to do is show it that it's okay for us to prioritize our well-being, because at the end of the day that's what's more important. And
mm,
I'm really grateful for my manager at Specialist Stern. She was really great at just making sure that no matter what, she would reiterate that it's okay, take rest, please don't worry. And I think I needed that. I almost needed to be reminded many, many times that it's okay
yeah.
to prioritize rest and looking after yourself. And it's
Mm.
so true, because at the end of the day, otherwise we'll keep burning out.
Mm. I think it's another interesting trait, and maybe it's not just neurodivergent specific, but asking for help. I had a conversation with a mum the other day who, I said, if you need anything, just let me know, and she was offering the same thing, and I'm like, but we both reflected that we're not very good at asking, and I think that's where it becomes much more important for the leader to be able to say, I can see that you are, how can I help you? Or suggesting, how about you take a day off, or how about you take some rest? I think that's really important.
Yeah, I agree.
So, for people who are late diagnosed, you've just spoken about, up until a couple of years ago, not knowing, like me, ADHD, late diagnosed as well. And uh, some things now make a lot of sense, and all those tabs open, and the whizzing of the brain, as an example. But how how do you think the late diagnosis changes the way neurodivergent people then experience work? Do you think there is something in and around the diagnosis?
Sure. Yeah. Look, I'll say that it's different for everyone. I
Yeah.
know a lot of people who don't feel like they need to get a diagnosis, but are definitely, undiagnosed ADHDers, and that's okay.
Mm.
For me, I think, and for a lot of people, it's almost like it was the piece of the puzzle missing. And we didn't know what was missing. And so we were just working extra hard to compensate or mask or whatever it might be. And we didn't know we were doing that either. So for me and many others, I think that piece of the puzzle brings awareness into ourselves. And so I found that really empowering. It's not the same for everyone. There is often a journey of grief, of, not knowing and grieving the identity you had before, and the what you could have gained if you'd known earlier. All those sorts of things are really normal and part of the process. However, and even I went through a bit of that in terms of not necessarily grieving that, but just reconciling my new identity, I suppose. And once I had done that to a certain extent, I felt empowered. I felt empowered by the fact that the insight that I had into my brain meant there was an explanation for why I did what I did, or how my brain was working, and it wasn't unique to me. So I suppose it goes back to that imposter syndrome and any other variation of that is commonly experienced, is that I now know that, for example, I'm terrible, but I interrupt people a lot. And I've always thought that as a deficit of mine. And of course it's not it's still not it's not an excuse, but I do find that then now I know that that is because of the way my brain is wired, not because I am rude. So you can see the distinction
Yeah.
is just small like that, but it can be something small to something significant, like finding a job, and maintaining a job. There's
Mm.
significant parts of being a human that we are associate to our identity. And so if you can understand the parts of your ADHD or your late diagnosis of whatever it might be, and learn about your brain and how you work best, I think there is so much to be gained
Mm.
from understanding that. So another
Mm.
example of my own was, prior to my ADHD diagnosis, I just found that I worked better when I was moving. Um,
Mm.
my colleagues will tell you that I went on a, a ridiculous number of walking meetings during COVID lockdowns. If I didn't have to be in front of my desk, I was walking. And so that told me a lot about
Mm.
perhaps the need for movement. And so since then, I have a standing desk, and I have one of those sort of walking pad treadmill things under my desk.
Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Something happens to my brain when I'm moving, and it pushes past the freeze state or the brain fog or whatever it might be, and the movement,
Mm.
that's part of my ADHD. It's obviously that hyperactivity part
Yeah.
potentially that I need to move, and
Mm.
my brain works better when I'm moving. So I feel good for knowing that now, and knowing that that's something I can
Yeah.
associate to what I need. And so it's small things like that that I've noticed just are more empowering. And I think many, it's shaping the experience of being at work, because we're finding more language due to the increased awareness. We can potentially start to feel comfortable in asking what we need, but not always. I know that's different for everyone, but certainly internally, I now know that I need to prioritize my energy. And
Mm.
that before I didn't have a word for, I didn't have language for. But now I know that that is my ADHD. I need to prioritize where my energy goes. And on days where I'm just not feeling it because of energy that was expended days prior, I now give myself the grace to say, okay, I'm just not feeling it, and not to push through. So I will know that that is something I need to at least plan for. If I know that there's 4 days of back-to-back training, for example, that I have to facilitate, I know that on the day after that I'm going to give myself a day of not having any meetings, for example, that I can just, move through the day and do things that I need to do that aren't a high priority. And so that for me has been a huge game changer. And so
Yeah.
everyone is different, but it does shift your understanding yourself, and therefore understands potentially if you're sharing some of that with your leader, it shifts their understanding of you too, which is critical.
Mm. I really like that first piece around just reframing to the negative to an understanding and an acceptance of that's how your brain works. And
Mm.
I know for Caboose, many of our community members do struggle with that. They sort of, need to reframe because, for so long, neurodivergent people have, only heard the negatives. And so reframing that, that's really
Mm.
cool. I've got a couple of related questions here from the audience. So, one of our members is asking, I'm really nervous to disclose my recent ADHD diagnosis given the lack of support and understanding when I disclose poor mental health, including clinical depression. Can you offer advice on if or how to proceed? It's a very tricky one,
Yeah,
depending
thank
on the
you.
organisation. So thank
Yes.
you, Jacqueline, for that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And you're not alone, that's for sure. There's still, so the white paper, I'll share it perhaps, and so that you have access
Yeah,
to it.
great. Mm,
It showed the significant number of neurodivergent employees who don't feel safe to disclose. I think it was something like 73%, and 94% of managers, leaders don't feel confident in how to support neurodivergent employees. And so there's obviously two things we can do there. But in terms of your question, what we do know is that leaders understand perhaps psychological safety more. And it's not that we necessarily need to say, I have a diagnosis. You don't need to disclose. That is a personal choice. But we can find language in talking to our leaders about what we need in terms of psychological safety. So things like clear communication, regular check-ins, building trust, all of those elements of a psychologically safe workplace almost start to show there's parallels there in terms of what we might need. And that in itself, we're noticing that it will start to shift in terms of the inclusive culture. So it does depend on your manager. It does depend on a lot of elements in terms of the culture and how understanding they are. But our white paper found that the number one adjustment that neurodivergent employees need and request by far, I think it was like 49% of the respondents said that the number one support that they want is an understanding and empathetic leader towards their neurodivergence. And it was that simple. That's not even a support. That's just a way of supervising, it's not like an accommodation. And then way further down, I think it was 16% said, acknowledging, able to adapt their environment in some ways. And so I would start by talking about how you work best without using the label if you're nervous about how that's going to land, and start to sort of, seek understanding through you as a human, not necessarily, providing the label, and then see how that conversation goes. It does, without knowing too much about the manager, I totally understand your hesitation and your nerves. And I'm sure that's also due to previous experiences where things haven't been positive either, because there's such a disappointingly high percentage of neurodivergent employees who have had harmful experiences or discrimination in the workplace. The statistics are staggering. So it's, starting to have the conversation in regards to how you work best without disclosing anything and see how that lands.
Mm. The other thing to consider, Jacqueline, is whether there's someone in your peer group who can advocate with you for any, any sort of changes, or to talking to the manager as well. Sometimes that can help, but it does depend on the size of the organisation as well. We've got a question here from Graham saying that many employers are small businesses and many of them would have a lack of understanding of how to work with neurodivergent people. Absolutely. And in smaller towns, and maybe the only jobs available to those people. Any ideas? I know Vicki and I were talking last year about trying to get out to rural and remote communities. It is a really tough one, but any thoughts on that for Graham, Vicki?
Such a good question. Look, I think, this is where the statistics start to come into play. That 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent, potentially in Australia. That's what we're sort of starting to see. 53% of Gen Z identify as being neurodivergent. And so we're starting to see perhaps neurodiversity awareness not as in our mind, it's never been a nice to have. It's always been essential. But for small businesses to start to prioritize that is starting to become critical, because retention in small businesses is critical. The cost of hiring and, that's significant. So I think it's starting to present the importance of it, depending on what your role is and how you can bring that into the conversation. But certainly as leaders, all that we ask of leaders is to lead by example. Like I said before, bring inclusion into the conversation at every point and start to show that it's important. So if you are running the small business, then it's bringing that into the fold if you can. But if you're an employee in a small business, then once again, same as the answer for Jacqueline, I think it's talking about your needs as a neurodivergent human, or as a human, sorry, without the label. And so explaining what you need, bringing in the psychological safety elements and what you need in terms of, once again, clear communication, environmental adaptations, potentially some other things that might work for you. But certainly we just know that starting to have those conversations about what you need, and that's where that universal design concept comes in. We use the acronym quite a lot, ATP, Ask the Person, which was coined by Randy Lewis in the US. And so he said that it's almost that simple. So if the leaders or the owners of the small business can start to ask the person what they need in terms of how their brain works, how do they learn best, how do they process information, how do they communicate best, what does burnout look like for them, that is an not easy. It's a small thing that can make a significant difference. It's not always easy, but it's creating a space where everyone answers those sorts of questions. We have a profile called the My Work profile, which does just that. It's a sort of 2-page document that allows all employees to say how they work best, as opposed to needing to provide a label. And so I think small changes like that will shift culture without needing to be about neurodiversity specifically.
Terrific. And we've got a lovely conversation going on in the chat as well. So Tyrone, thank you, acknowledging that he, they, them experienced burnout and confirmed those symptoms. Then a discussion about how we can encourage people yet to be late diagnosed to start thinking well and supporting others diagnosed around them. So we're getting to know that there are lots more undiagnosed, maybe in big numbers, and many of us that now know can see them. So I suppose that one is more about how do we start to support people, which probably leads to my next question around how managers and leaders can support, and maybe it's not just managers and leaders, but peers, better support neurodivergent employees without making them feel singled out or othered. What are your thoughts there?
Yes. So that's another good question. Great questions, Michelle. I'm in the audience. Thank you so much. I think thinking about the things that we can do to normalize adjustments. So everything that we've spoken about so far, as Robin mentioned early on, is something that will help everybody. These are adjustments that will help everybody. And often we sort of list the really most common adjustments, and it's what we all need. The research that's shown on what's required or what's benefits an environment in the workplace in terms of inclusion is actually what we know helps everybody. And so it's making adjustments normalized at every level.
Mm.
And I think, once again, modeling that. So showing that you also need to take time here and there. You work flexibly. You need sensory friendly spaces. You might need additional supports or communication. For me, for example, having things in writing, a verbal conversation in writing. And so often just saying, it would be really great if I could get that in writing, or, something to that effect to show that we all have our own way of working, and it could be small things like that. I think investing and showing that neurodiversity awareness is important. It's, like I said before, not just a nice to have, but if you're a leader, you have an opportunity to bring it into regular team meetings in terms of resources that are available, or providing time for people to, watch the micro learnings, neuro nuggets, for example. It's really
Yes,
important
exactly.
to allow time for people to access those resources and learn from that. And you can only do that as a leader by saying, this is important. I want you to carve out time, and this is a priority. And of course, lived experience voices. So managers have an opportunity to, if someone does disclose, obviously that conversation is important, but if you can lean into learning about their lived experience, you have an asset in that team in terms of somebody who can talk about their neurodivergence potentially and provide insight into neurodivergence in your team or your workplace. And that's a real asset in itself. And we don't want to be, once again, singling people out or othered. We want it to be seen as a strength and an asset to the team in terms of what that person can bring, and shifting the dialogue, I suppose. But I think at the core of this, like I said before, we now know the white paper showed that exactly a neuroinclusive environment is it parallels a psychologically safe environment. So what a neurodivergent employee needs, and how a leader needs to lead in a way that is neuroinclusive, is exactly the same as the psychological safe, the indicators of psychological
Yeah, right.
safety. So to me, that brings it back around. It's, we don't want to be othered. We want to just create a space where everyone can thrive. It is looking at the individual, removing assumptions, finding out how they work best. And that takes effort from the leader, but not anything more than what you would be expected for just being a good human. So yeah, once again,
Right.
not making
Some of the core basic. Yeah.
Yes. And that's it. So if we can just think about it through the lens of psychological safety, both in terms of how a leader operates and in terms of the culture we want to create, then I think we're going to start to see small shifts without it needing to be about neurodiversity specifically, or singling people out, or ensuring that everyone has, the specific understanding that Bob, for example, is autistic, and learning about Bob, it becomes less about the individual and more just about all humans and what we're going through. Because, neurodivergence, once again, it's increasing in terms of prevalence, and but also there's so many intersecting conditions or experiences that might impact somebody, how they show up today. So we want to be supporting people in terms of how they're showing up today, or in this season, or, in this particular job.
Yeah. The whole concept of othered has been a really interesting one for, even our Kaboose clients when we talk to them about implementing neuro nuggets, and actually being really curious, learning about your colleagues, whether they're neurodivergent or not, and instead of making the assumptions, as you said, actually just be really curious. And it's amazing when teams start to be curious about their peers, and managers are curious about their team members, and creating that culture where people just feel like they can share. It's such a lovely thing. Not always easy to get to. You're obviously talking to lots of organisations as well. What are you seeing in terms of shifts at the moment, or conversations that you think leaders are having around neurodiversity, or has it, you know, is the pathway more around psych safety?
Yeah, I think the shift is the aha moments that are happening with leaders when neuroinclusion is understood through the lens of psychological safety. I think that um, because for so long, diversity and inclusion initiative, neurodiversity sort of sat as as a diversity and inclusion initiative. It was almost like a separate project or program that had a separate budget. Um, and to me, that's always been limiting. It's limiting because obviously budgets depend on it, but it's seen as this extra thing that needs to happen and live in isolation over here. However, actually, it is simply just being, as we said, all the way through. It is what works for everyone. It is about psychological safety. And now I'm really excited to see the shift. I mean, it's been happening over the last maybe couple of years where it's leaning more into not needing to know this thing over here, but more just if I am just more inclusive every day and make these small changes, then I am in fact not only supporting neurodivergent individuals, but supporting everybody. And I think
Mm.
we're seeing a lot of change, but of course every workplace is different. And at the end of the day, fortunately and unfortunately, leaders have a really critical role to play. And it does come down to good leadership. It does come down to trust and building and being authentic and being vulnerable. And all of those traits of a good leader do in fact show that that is what supports neurodivergent employees to thrive. Because yeah, so we're getting
Mm.
there. I think we've seen huge shifts since COVID in terms of those conversations. Certainly we've made leaps and bounds from pre-COVID in terms of understanding and celebration and acceptance. And but I think we've still got a really long way to go.
Yeah. A couple more questions or comments here. Tony says, thank you. Love the language of ADHDers. Hopefully, we can help bring the other useful language, free burnout, psych safety into our workplaces. In brackets, and menopause. Yes, that could be a whole other divergent discussion,
I think
which I
so.
think we have had. We have had one, but I think we could
Mm,
definitely have another. Some
mhm,
interesting research coming out about that and late diagnosis. So,
mm.
yes, thank you for that observation. Uh, let's see. Robin says, re your comment. Magnetizing, creating your own tribe. I've seen this work well in workplaces, which creates safe places. That's true. For neurodivergent species to meet together and share experiences. I think that's right. I mean,
Mm,
1 in 5. I mean, there are clearly other people. If you're in a workplace of more than that,
mm.
that are neurodivergent. So I think sharing experiences with your tribe that you find within the workplace.
And just
Uh,
can I just add to that
mm,
as well? One of the
yeah.
biggest activities that shifts the culture is when there is disclosure or speaking of lived experience at a very senior level. So it is one of the most impactful things that can be done because, based on everything we've said, it says it's okay to talk about this here. We
Mm,
are talking about this, we are bringing this into the conversation, and I'm saying that this is happening for me. So something to think about for some workplaces, that if you can start to see representation at a senior level, that will have a huge ripple effect in terms of culture and safety.
mm. It's about that, having role models. And if we go
Mm,
back, a decade ago, the role model was having women, maybe 2 decades, but having women
mm,
in senior roles and for younger people coming, graduates, if they can't see good role models, it's very hard. It's the same in neurodivergence. If you can't see neurodivergent leaders and you
mm.
can't see a workplace where you have your peers, it does make it really difficult.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's it. And I think I also heard someone say once that it's almost like it was my amazing autistic friend. She said it's almost like it becomes less diverse the more senior you go. It's certainly in corporate
Yes.
Australia, which is obviously not the case. It's
Yes.
1 in 5 at every level. It's just that we need to
Yes.
make it safe to talk about it at each level, at all levels,
It's
sorry.
very
And
true.
so, yeah, that's it. And I think it's
Mhm.
acknowledging that we all need some supports. We all need things, standing desk,
Mm,
whatever it might be, things in writing. Everybody needs something.
mm.
And one of the things that we're finding is the most impactful, but what not many people know about is neurodiversity coaching. So we've been providing neurodiversity coaching both at Specialist and at Little Neuroinclusion Agency. And that coaching is the whole concept is not necessarily just for the employee, but it's for the manager as well, to have one-on-one support, to know how to confidently support and help that person thrive. It's for the employee to understand their neurodivergence and what they need to thrive. And it's almost like a secret. We don't want it to be a secret, but just
No,
a adjustment or a support that will work for everybody. And it's about getting it out there to show that that's something. I mean, everyone, I don't know about people here, but we've all had coaches or mentors at some point, and it's just bringing that back into, oh yeah, that's something we all need sometimes. And it's really helpful to have a specialist who can support with that.
yeah, exactly. Well, that hour sped by, and I feel like I've still got, a lot of questions I want to ask. So we might have to do a part two to this. But before we finish up, I guess, what advice would you give neurodivergent adults? Perhaps it is those late diagnosed who are sort of feeling the pressure, to prove themselves at work. It goes back to that masking.
Mm.
Uh, what's one takeaway or one thing they could try in the next little while?
I think remember that you are not the issue. The issue is the age-old systems, processes, and culture that the workplace is made up of, and that your incredible brain is what you need to understand more of. If you can learn more about your brain and how you work best, there's actually small things that you can do. But also then if you can find that language without having to disclose potentially if that's a worry or, you're nervous about that, it's finding a language to say, this is how I work best. And a good manager should respond to that, because I would love that. I would love to be told this is how I work best. It's like a cheat sheet on how to support someone to thrive. I mean, amazing. So if you can find the language, we have, like I said, my work profile on our website. We can send the link. It's just a tool that will allow you to say, this is how I work best without disclosing anything,
Mm,
but learn into understanding your strengths and find the right environment for you. The environment piece is almost just as critical as being able to do the job itself. So if you're working or looking for a particular job, try and understand what the environment is like first, because it is just as critical as the job itself, and the people leader match is also just as critical. So try and find the right
great
place for you to
advice.
be looking, and lean into trying to find the language to explain your strengths and how you work best.
Amazing. Well, if there are no other questions, I will just check the chat here. Tyrone, funny story. At my previous job, I somehow came into a social leadership role in our friend group, and I still haven't fully embraced. Neurodiversity, but I like to think I cultivated a safe space for my people. Excellent. It's ironic that their chairman happens to be neurodivergent, and most of them didn't know it. So that's because people are not talking about it as we hope they will, with the wonderful work that Vicky's doing, and with Kaboose Neuro Nuggets as well. Together we want to change that conversation. So that's probably the end of this conversation, but we'll definitely have to host another one. For those who registered today, we're also going to send you out a 7-day free trial of Kaboose Neuro Nuggets, either for yourself or if you want to share it with your organisations. These are small sort of practical guides to help you navigate life and work, or for your managers. We'll also have a link to the white paper, which we'll send out, and Vicky's link to her website, so you can, if you need coaching or workplace training, she's the person to go to. And thank you all for joining us for this discussion, and we'll have the recording out to you very soon. Thanks,
you.
Vicky.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the great conversation. Thanks, Michelle.